Thank you. Yes, please take a seat again. We have John McClean, the Reverend Doctor from this very college, Christchurch College, and he's a lecturer in ethics and theology. And I understand you live in the beautiful Blue Mountains with your wife, and you have wilderness, World Heritage Site wilderness opposite you. So that just sounds marvellous. Now, let's see which photo you've brought with you this morning. Would you like to explain something about this?
So this is the mouth of Boreal Lake down on the south coast of New South Wales, site of many family holidays over the years, and photo taken at dusk, just very restorative place to be. Thank you. Okay, can you put the slide up? Great. So you're doing very well. Morning tea is in sight. And you've probably worked out that each of the presenters are drawing on something of our own sort of area of our discipline, our area of interest and study. And so what I want to do is look from the perspective of theological ethics, or sometimes it'd be called moral theology. And what I'm talking about very much assumes the material that Lionel and Kit have already covered, and certainly touches on the issues that Daryl's been talking about. And so you'll see lots and lots of overlaps. I'll point out some of them, but I won't point them all out because there wouldn't be much else left to the talk if I just pointed out all the overlaps with what everyone else has said. I want to think about this idea of moral vision. Let me explain what I mean, first of all, with an example. My wife, Liz, helps to lead a hospital for children with very severe disabilities. And over dinner, we often, of course, talk about the children at the hospital and the staff at the hospital and how people interact with the children. And it strikes me that the children at this hospital can be viewed in different ways. So it's very easy for the nursing staff and the other medical staff to view them, particularly in terms of their needs, as they assess their mobility and think about what they need in terms of good medical care. They can be viewed economically. There's a certain cost to the hospital of every child they're looking after, and at least some of the children also bring in income as well, and so you can view them economically. They can be seen as burdens on their family in the way they impact every aspect of life of their exhausted parents and frustrated siblings. Now, none of those three views is wrong. Each of them is relevant. Each of them is important. But it's very obvious that good care of the children in the hospital requires them to be seen first and foremost as people and individuals with their own stories and their own personalities, as well as deserving dignity and protection. And I really love listening to Liz and some of the other staff that I overhear from time to time talking about the kids in that way. And it's apparent that as they spend time with the children, they learn to view them as individuals, although that can be quite a challenge initially. And as they do that, they grow in motivation to care as well as gaining insight into how to do that well. Now, I think the staff at that hospital provide a good example of what it means to develop a moral vision. And I want to take a similar approach to think about how that should shape our approach to creation care. In some senses, a vision has to precede, or right vision has to precede action, but in other ways it develops through action. Now, this idea of moral vision is used quite widely in ethical literature. It seems to have been popularised in modern ethical discussion by Iris Murdoch, the British philosopher and novelist. The metaphor, if that's the right word to use for this, of moral vision is somewhat similar to a worldview, since it indicates a way of looking at life and looking at situations that's going to guide our actions. But the way in which moral vision is used often also encourages us to look more carefully and to attend to the details of the situations and the context and the people about which we're concerned. And worldview doesn't always do quite the same thing. So the idea of moral vision emphasises that ethics is not fundamentally or simply procedural or calculative, There are places where we have to make specific decisions and add up all the various factors, but there's something more basic to being moral than that. And the way in which we live will always be or should be driven by the background beliefs and attitudes and desires which are going to shape our ethics. The idea of a moral vision implies that we can have a relatively coherent set of beliefs and commitments and narratives and habits. And that's part of the reason, or part of what the point Iris Murdoch was making as she developed this idea of moral vision in reaction to more atomistic views of ethics that just saw each decision, each occasion as an opportunity for a discrete and unrelated decision compared to other decisions you've made. And she's stressing, no, there's a coherence about the moral life. And a moral vision can be developed and trained. Now, all those features make moral vision a good way to approach Christian ethics, and what I want to then do is think about how that would engage us in looking at creation care. So moral vision, Christian moral vision, will have to begin with God. It is God, the Holy One, who is the centre of the Christian moral vision. He holds our vision. And only in his holy light do we then see light, to quote Psalm 36. And so I think an appropriate place to start is to think about God's holiness. A great deal I'd want to say about that, but I'm not going to spend a long time on it. God's holiness is both majestic and moral. He is majestic, he's greater and bigger and more powerful and more important than anything else. He outstrips everything else added up together. And yet his majestic holiness is not a kind of raw, uncontrolled power like a raging sea or a roaring fire. God's holiness and his majesty is integrated with and expressed in his moral goodness. And so all those terms we associated with goodness are rightly and fully applied only to God. He is just, he is faithful, he is true, compassionate and patient. God is love. And the Christian moral vision really is grounded in recognising that God's holiness is beautiful. That at least intellectually and spiritually, we want to see God in his holiness. And indeed, I think the whole idea of God's glory speaks of the fact that not only is this something that we perceive intellectually and spiritually, but ultimately physically as well. So Jonathan Edwards claims that God is exalted above all other beings by his beauty. He describes God's holiness as properly the beauty of the divine nature. God's holiness then draws our attention. We see his glory and we're drawn to it, or we should be. Now, of course, God's holiness is fully personal. We can't think properly about God's holiness apart from the fact that he's the triune God, Father, Son and Spirit, who together possess life and being and are fully given to one another in perfect love. And what we know of God in his revelation to us flows from who he is in himself, the Holy Trinity, and so that he is the ground and the centre of a Christian moral vision. Now, what does all that mean for moral vision? Well, first of all, it means that the orientation of all reality is towards God. Things aren't arbitrary or chaotic or random. The rhyme and reason of everything comes from him. It also means, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, the universe is charged with life and goodness and truth and beauty and love from God. Those are not simply ideas that it turns out humans like or that we like in our culture. They resonate with us because they reflect the Holy One who has made us. And so Christians know that we live in a world which is framed and penetrated by the Holy God, and we live in his presence. And it's a rich vision of God that then funds a true moral vision. So what I'm talking about, I hope, is a moral vision that's grounded in that kind of vision of God. Now, I want to change tact quite surprisingly. The Bull Oak woodlands. We now turn our vision to creation. And I want to do that by looking at a particular ecological community. I've chosen the Bull Oak woodlands of the Riverina and the Murray-Darling. Now, I haven't chosen these because these are an ecology that I've got a particular expertise in, but then I don't have an expertise in any ecology, so that's okay. But I've chosen them because I think they're an environment that don't provide us with obvious postcard scenery, and so perhaps are less likely to receive our attention and our vision. So the bull oak woodlands are badly degraded, suffered from the not surprising effects of clearing and grazing and rabbits, wind erosion, the effects of reduced precipitation and with climate change. So although the bull oak species is still common, the woodlands environment is almost lost. And sustained attempts to regenerate areas over the last decade or so have really not been so far very successful. So there's what is thought to have been the extent of the community pre-settlement. That's where there's some remnants of it now. So as we think about how we're taught to look at the world by God, I want us to try it out by looking at these woodlands. Now, I'm only too aware that there are plenty of people who've looked far more intently and consistently than I have at this, and can see far more, and I'm sure there's people in the room who could do that. So I'm not making any claim to any kind of comprehensive reflection on that ecology, but just as a bit of a test case or an example of what it might mean or what it means to look as we're trained by God. So first of all, we look at the creation knowing that God is the creator. We worship the God who made and rules and cares for the world. And we've heard it matters to him, it glorifies him, and so it should matter to us. And knowing the creator directs our attention to the world, the creation that he's made. I heard about earlier the discussion about intrinsic and instrumental value. Seems to me, for Christians, it's hardly a discussion. The value of the world comes from God, not from us. The value of the world doesn't simply lie in the utilitarian value it has for us, although it certainly has that. But to that extent, it must have intrinsic value of being a creation, or at least its value arises from the stable relation it has with God as the creator, not our stance towards it, not the utility it has for us. And biblical praise of God as creator reflects that intrinsic value. The creation psalms, passages in Proverbs, the prophets, the Gospels, the epistles, I think particularly highlight two things. First of all, they teach us to see the glory of God in the creation. But then secondly, they teach us to see that this creation is under God's loving care, his provision for it. And so they often exalt the wisdom and beauty of the non-human creation. And those kind of passages help to form the moral vision with which we look at the creation. They prompt us to enjoy the creation rather than exploit it, to see it first of all as the theatre of the glory of God, as Calvin says, before we think about how it's provided for human benefit. So we see it also under God's care. So certainly biologists can help us to see the created order that way, as they trace God's provision within ecological systems as well as within particular organisms. But artists as well can often help us to see the glory of God's holiness in creation and his providential care. So this is a print of galahs in the bull oak tree by Leslie van der Soels, 2004. And I think it reflects something of the protection that habitat provides for the birds. And so it's a little glimpse of God's providential care through the bull oak ecology. We then turn to see ourselves as stewards. Again, been mentioned lots of times already this morning. God's entrusted the world to humanity. Not that he's absent or inactive in the meantime, but he has given us a care for the world. Being stewards is not the only way we should see ourselves, but it is an important way to see ourselves. We might think of Jesus' parable of the servants entrusted with wealth to care for and develop as a way of engaging our vision of humanity living in God's world. That parable from Matthew 25 could be read exploitively if we think that the servants simply would have maximised the profits that they could get out of the wealth that they were left, or the talents, traditionally we've called them. But when we remember that the wealth they've been given belongs to the master, and to step outside of the parable, the wealth of creation is a creation that he loves with its beauty and diversity, then the parable talks to us about our role as stewards, not justifying any exploitation, but caring for and developing the non-human creation well. Throughout this conference, indeed in the title of the conference, we've talked about creation care. And maybe that's not the only label we want to use, but I think that is a great label for Christians to use, not just to use the kind of generic environmental concerns, but to emphasise the fact that we see humans as called to care for the creation that God has made. So as we think about the Bullock woodlands, we recognise, we see the exploitation and the depletion that's occurred there in a whole lot of different ways. And sadly, almost all of the impact of human activity on that ecology has led to its decline. But here's one shot of one person taking a positive stewardship responsibility in those woodlands. We then see the world as somewhere where we can love our neighbour. Now, I think this has probably been mentioned in every talk so far, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. I too was thinking of pointing, and I will point briefly to the Good Samaritan as the parable that really opens up our understanding of what it means to be a neighbour and who it is who's the neighbour to us. That ultimately the Christian vision is to see our neighbours as whoever they may be and wherever they are, within our contact, people for whom we should care. And certainly a depleted environment, changing climate and water shortages have a huge impact on the population of the world. And as we've already said a couple of times, it's almost always the poorest who pay the highest costs. And so a concern for mercy and justice, for love of neighbour, should alert us to the need to preserve and maintain the environment. The Bullock ecology presumably made a contribution to the health of the Murray-Darling River, and so regeneration there could have some impact on water quality and river health downstream. This would help river communities in South Australia, although looking around the literature I couldn't really find any discussion of that. But it is an excuse to have one postcard photo of looking further downstream down the Murray River. We then also are trained to look at the world in which we live as frustrated but under the promise of renewal. Romans 8 talks to us of the creation being frustrated and groaning. And the previous observations I'd mentioned about the Bullock ecology, certainly it's very easy to see the frustration and groaning in the degradation of the Bullock woodlands. And so we look at it as frustrated and wounded, but also as a world, as part of a world which we know God will restore and glorify. And because we know God will restore and glorify it, we do what we can to protect and help it. Now, it may be that this particular ecology won't be restored until the new creation. But again, as we've heard several times this morning, Christian creation care is an act of hope grounded in God's promise for the future, not in our confidence in human ability. Recognising our call to stewardship, but putting our hope in God. Finally, the created order invites us to act virtuously, or as we probably more commonly speak in evangelical circles, to display the fruits of the Spirit. If by the Spirit we exercise self-restraint, humility, wisdom, benevolence, frugality, love, hope, justice, thankfulness, courage, all of those will contribute to creation care. And to think about the created order and the non-human creation as an area in which we can exercise the fruits of the Spirit, and therefore where we can act virtuously, I think helps us, especially with the problem that we often face, that we can't see how our actions will make any immediate and long-term impact on the broad global issues of environmental concerns. Now, we should certainly think about how we can address the broad global issues, but we're also always called to live God's way, even if we can't see how us living God's way particularly will change the bigger picture. A landowner or a land care group in the Bull Oak region can act virtuously and seek to care for the ecology and so glorify God, even if the outcome itself is unclear. So I've suggested how a Christian moral vision might direct and sustain creation care in general, and in one Australian ecosystem in particular. The Australian Church needs to learn, or God's Church in general needs to learn to view the non-human creation as the theatre of God's glory, wounded and needing our care. We have to learn to see ways that we can bless our neighbour through caring for creation, how we can live in hope of the renewal of all things in Christ's kingdom, and that will train and shape our moral vision, engage us in creation care. Christian faith offers resources which fund environmental action, and those are resources that our culture really desperately needs. So I want to finish with a timely quote from a book that Darryl referenced as well, a kind of prophetic work from almost 50 years ago, Francis Schaeffer's book Pollution and the Death of Man. He says this: a truly biblical Christianity has a real answer to the ecological crisis. And that hasn't changed. Thanks.